I don't quite know how to start this review. I say this because leading up to this game's release, my opinion on it went from positive to negative and back and forth again. The game is a traditional RPG with 8 different characters that come together with different class abilities? Sounds great. What's that? The characters' stories never actually intertwine, they're all independent? That sucks. Oh, you say there's a final chapter where their stories do come together? Oh, that makes it all worth it. Oh, you're not done? You say that the bosses in this game take way too long to die? Oh, that's stupid. The combat is a much more refined version of the Bravely Default series? That sounds too good to be true. As you can see, I've heard a mix of tales from different sources, and seeing how this game was flying off the store shelves, I had to see what all the fuss was about. But for the most part, reception of the game was positive. I'm old-fashioned, so I waited a week until a physical copy was available at EB Games, and I ended up getting the last copy and played it without delay. I didn't want to release this review until I had completed it fully, and it's been a week and a half, but I finally finished it. It's really quite ironic that right before playing this game, I had completed a 100% playthrough of Bravely Second, because with that game still fresh in my mind, I do understand how one would say this game is a better Bravely Default, though I wouldn't necessarily agree with the statement. My close friend once jokingly referred to this game as Bravely Traveler Octopath Expansion. That got a chuckle out of me, but it highlights how similar this game is to the Bravely Default series, and I'll make some comparisons to that series throughout the review, and how Octopath borrows from Bravely Default both in gameplay and visually. I suppose now is the best time for me to talk about what was arguably the biggest selling point of this game, being the visuals. Octopath serves as one of the greatest modern examples of a game that can look stunning without having hyper-realistic graphics. People always assume that graphics make a game look good, but I've always argued that art style and visual aesthetics matter much more, and Octopath proves that point for me. The charm of pixel art is timeless. I have a great appreciation for the approach to the world design, where the Bravely Default series puts a 3D character superimposed on a 2D background, though not always. Octopath puts 2D characters in a much more 3D background, pixel art as it may be. The style really brings me back to the days of traditional Paper Mario on the Nintendo 64 and GameCube. In retrospect, I suppose having 2D pixel art characters roaming 3D environments isn't too new, considering many of the first Final Fantasy titles were just that. But it's the first time we get to see it approached in full beautiful HD to such a masterful degree. In my opinion, the art direction is where this game shines the most. Both the overworld and battle sequences have wonderful visual direction and satisfying audio to accompany them. The sound direction in this game is also very good, at least where sound effects are concerned. You can notice and appreciate the difference between the crunch of walking on grass and the tippity-tap of slippers on stone. Battle effects have satisfying weight to them, and the sound effects played when landing hits on an opponent while they're in break status is just ooh. So that's great. The music is okay, I guess. I know a lot of people love the music, but I sort of have the same problem with the music in this game that people had in Breath of the Wild, being that the soundtrack isn't super defined. It feels too much like elevator music. There are a handful of maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 songs that are really, really good. The one playing right now being my absolute favorite. Besides those, I thought the soundtrack wasn't as good as people made it out to be. That by no means implies I think the soundtrack is bad. I think it services the game just fine, but that's just it. Not super incredible, not bad, just adequate, with some stellar sequences every once in a while. With the exception of boss themes, I actually have a distaste for the common enemy encounter themes. Sure, there are only 2 of those in the game, so it might be a compliment to say that there are only 2 songs I actively disliked. But considering these random enemy encounter themes are going to be the ones you hear the most in the game, it started giving me a headache pretty quickly, especially because you can't reliably avoid enemy encounters in this game. Which brings me to the gameplay. I'm not going to lie, the gameplay was a mixed bag, and it's where my opinion fluctuated the most. The early game bosses and enemies have a lot of HP, and you will do comparatively very little damage so early in the game that these enemies take forever to kill. I found myself rolling my eyes and muttering, how the hell is this thing not dead yet? The mid-game during most characters, Chapter 2 and 3 is where the game gets a bit better. After picking up secondary classes, more on that later, leveling up a bit, and getting access to more move combinations, bosses become a welcome challenge but are no longer damage sponges, and this is where the game is at its best. Any boss afterwards becomes a complete joke. You can end boss fights in just about 3 to 4 turns by just stacking buffs onto one ally, lowering enemy resistances, applying break, and then hitting the boss with a max boosted spell, which usually just kills them instantly. So the late game combat becomes super degenerate. This is where I started to scoff at people saying that this combat system was better than Bravely Default because you couldn't break the game with crazy team compositions, which couldn't be further from the truth. The problem could have been easily avoided if they did not introduce a passive skill from the warrior class line, Surpassing Power, which is a skill that allowed you to simply bypass the damage limit of 9,999 damage. So once your characters get to level 40 plus, the boss fights tend to become a complete joke, with the exception of the optional final area of the game. And this is where my biggest problem with the game lies: lack of clarity. The game is so vague about what it wants you to do, especially during the final area. Without spoiling too much story-wise, the game gives you no recommended party level, which it always does before a new area. Inside, it's a boss gauntlet of 8 bosses you fought previously before the actual final boss. It's a point of no return, there are no save points, and before fighting the final boss, the game only then informs you that you need to have 2 parties ready to go, not just one, which the game had never asked you to do before in any other part of the game. As if that wasn't bad enough, they don't even tell you what you'll be doing with those 2 parties. Does it mean that I'll be controlling all 8 characters at once? Are there 2 boss phases and I use one team for each phase? Or is it that when my first team dies, my second team comes along to take their place, and then when that team dies, it's game over? The worst part is that if you die, the game boots you back to your last save point outside of the dungeon and you have to do the whole thing over again. It's complete trial and error, which is normally fine for most boss fights because they typically have, I don't know, save points right before the encounter so that you can lose, find out more about the boss, and try again. The game gives you no information about what you're undertaking or how, and then punishes you for not being prepared. It left a horrible taste in my mouth, especially because the purpose of the final area is to pretty much be a giant exposition dump to tie up loose ends in the story. Everything I've just told you about this final area is not clearly laid out for the player, and thus they cannot make an informed decision about how they should approach it. The vagueness problem extends to the side quests in the game as well. You can keep track of your active side quests in the main menu, but there are no objective markers to let you know where you're supposed to go. And the solution to some of these quests are just ridiculous. Some guy tells you he's having trouble catching fish, and then you get a new quest. What? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to solve this? More often than not, the solution to the quest given to you by civilians is to go to some other town on the other side of the damn world map, inquire or take an item from some random person who you have no indication of knowing that they have what you need, and then go back and talk to the quest giver. It might be okay if the rewards were worth it, but they are not. Most of the time, it's a pathetic amount of money, and like an herb I could have bought for 50 gold. The monotony of the quest means I stop paying attention to them, which is bad. The unique abilities of your party to challenge an enemy, steal or buy items from them, recruit them temporarily, and inquire with them for knowledge is meant for you to pay attention to each individual citizen because they may have something you need, be it an item or information. However, due to the low reward of fulfilling quests, you stop paying attention or caring. I found myself mindlessly walking up to each NPC without talking to them, just steal their stuff, find out what they know, and then move on to the next one, my brain on autopilot the entire time. TLTW, the side quests are a major flop because of the vague and often unspoken requirements to complete them. Octopath Traveler's lack of clarity extends to the jobs as well. You can find optional secondary jobs in random caves strewn throughout the world. As far as I'm concerned, the location of these caves isn't revealed to the player. It's the only time I used a guide to point me to where I needed to go. Took a while, but let me get to the combat. The combat is serviceable. It's what somebody would expect out of traditional Final Fantasy, but there are 2 new mechanics here: boost points and break. Boost points, or BP, was pretty much pulled straight out of Bravely Default. Every turn you gain 1 BP. You can choose to consume BP up to a max of 3 times to augment your abilities by either making them stronger or buffs last longer. In Bravely Default, Brave Points didn't make the one move you chose to use more powerful. It allowed you to choose multiple moves in a turn, which allowed for more complex setups. The drawback is that you didn't automatically gain Brave Points every turn. The only way you could gain BP was by guarding. In addition, you could give yourself negative Brave points, and if you did, you couldn't act as that character for as many BP as you needed to recover, which added a risk-reward factor to the game not present in Octopath's boost point system. Break is a new mechanic where every opponent has a certain amount of shield points, and you chip away at these points by hitting enemies with specific weapon or elemental attack types that the enemy is weak to. When their shield hits 0, they can't commit an action the next turn, and they'll take bonus damage from you. This makes combat engaging in a way, because you constantly have an objective to work toward, but I don't think the game struck a good balance with how much damage you do pre and post break. You do pretty much no damage when an opponent isn't in break status, but when they are, you do way too much damage. This makes all my attacks against enemies feel completely futile and pointless until I've applied break, which means a lot of waiting around until then. That's another thing, waiting around. Fights take a long time in this game, and with no way to guarantee not running into enemies, you're going to be fighting a lot. Bravely Default remedied both of these issues by giving you the ability to speed up combat and completely avoid enemy encounters if you so chose. Grinding is also easier in Bravely because you can create command sets with predetermined moves for all your characters and they'll fight automatically. Not only was grinding faster, but it's more convenient. In Octopath, grinding for levels is excruciating unless you run into a Kate, which are these cat enemies that give up a lot of experience. It's almost like the game doesn't want you gaining experience though, because these cats have an absurd amount of evasion, and if you don't kill them instantly, they just run away, denying you any experience. There is another way to gain experience quickly through the use of Bewildering Grace, which is a move that the Dancer class learns, and when used, will apply a randomly generated assortment of effects, one of these being experience times 2 or experience times 5. The ability to potentially level up more quickly and thus reduce the amount of time I spend grinding, and then locking it behind an RNG attack, which also might have the random adverse effect of hurting my party instead, is frustrating to say the least. It doesn't help that I'm effectively grinding for 2 parties, not just one, since I have 8 characters to look after and I can only take 4 with me at any given time. You can't equip the same secondary class on more than one character, which is pretty limiting because there are only 12 classes in the game. There are also certain things that one character can do, but not others. For instance, Therion the Thief is the only character in the game that can open purple chests in the overworld, mostly found within deep dungeons. Because of this, I felt so disincentivized to replace Therion in favor of another party member, lest I missed out on collecting the rare loot found in these chests. Why couldn't this just be a skill anyone could learn through the Thief skill tree? It makes it wildly inconvenient for me to structure parties in such a way that I don't have to constantly backtrack to enemy-filled areas for items I missed, especially because I can't replace the very first party member I picked when the game started until I finish their story to completion. Apothecary is another class that frustrates me. Alphen the Apothecary is a very powerful and useful character because the ability to concoct potions with a variety of effects for allies and enemies is actually pretty strong. However, applying the Apothecary class to any other character does not yield the concoct command, only basic skills like a one-man heal and status ailment remover. Why? This makes Apothecary as a class practically pointless on any other character that isn't Alphen. Sure, Therion's ability to open purple chests in the overworld is unique to him, but at least in combat, anyone can be as effective as the thief as he is. Same complaint for Haunted, who is the only character capable of capturing and using beasts. All of this serves to limit options pretty extensively and prevents me from using party members I like. What if I like the Apothecary class but don't care for Alphen? It feels inefficient to equip Apothecary on any character that isn't Alphen because I don't get the concoct command. If I have Therion, for instance, whose primary class is Thief and secondary class is Apothecary, and then I have Alphen, whose primary class is Apothecary and secondary class I choose as Thief, Alphen has more in-combat options than Therion does, even though they both have the same 2 classes equipped. That makes no sense to me at all. As a JRPG, the story is, of course, a main focus of the game, as it is with most JRPGs. Without spoiling too much, I thought it left something to be desired. All 8 storylines happen independently of each other, so the characters never actually have any meaningful story interaction with each other. I think the game spreads itself out too thin. There are too many independent storylines and thus no character gets any time to develop. Typically, a great way for character personalities to shine through is to show them interacting with the other protagonists, but that can't happen here, at least not canonically. You see, there are these things called travel banters, which appear during a character's chapter. The game will prompt you to press the plus symbol to hear optional dialogue between the members of your current party. However, these interactions are not mandatory. The characters are never able to say anything of substance because of this. It's almost always something like, "Oh, are you ready to fight the boss? You bet, I'll have your back every step of the way, friend," or some generic stuff like that, not the most riveting character development. Every character ending has multiple plot holes and loose ends, and the only way to get any closure on these facts is to go to the final area of the game, which, as I said before, is optional, tedious, and ended up disappointing me with a complete Deus Ex Machina character that tries hastily to connect the storylines together. I don't understand why they did this. If they knew they wanted to connect the storylines together through this character introduced out of nowhere at the very end, why not just work that into every story? You could have had all 8 characters sniff out the villain's trail independently, and then when all storylines are done, have a unified Chapter 5 where all characters come together to confront the final boss. It would have been much more organic. Doing it this way is just bizarre. All in all, if you haven't played a turn-based strategy RPG, especially ones developed by Square Enix like the Final Fantasies, in a long time, this game will strike that nostalgia head on. It's fun to look at and pleasing to listen to, and once you hit that sweet spot for combat, where you start doing more damage but not enough to make the bosses a complete joke, the combat is also pretty good too. Unfortunately, my fun time with it was short-lived. Overworld travel is a chore, class customization options are surprisingly not as varied as I like them to be, grinding takes entirely too long, and the story is disjointed, clunky, and, especially during the final area, rushed. It almost feels wrong to talk about how much I didn't enjoy the game because, as traditional JRPGs go, I spent a lot of time playing it to completion, so it's such a shame that it ended up squandering so much of its potential. I don't see myself doing another playthrough of this game unless there are some patches or DLC that add a lot of quality of life changes to the game. If you're looking for a traditional turn-based Final Fantasy-esque game developed by Square Enix, I'd recommend Bravely Second over this game for sure. Yes, it's a sequel, but it opens up by summarizing the plot of the first game in its intro, so you won't miss out on anything too important. However, if you don't have a 3DS, Octopath Traveler is a decent substitute. When it comes to ratings, I realize I've fallen into the trap of rating games too high. Logically, even a 5 out of 10 is still an average game, even if for some reason a lot of consumers don't see it that way. Thus, I'm going to briefly revisit my other reviews quickly. ARMS is a 4, Hyrule Warriors is a 5.5, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is still a 9.5, and as for Octopath Traveler, I'm rating it a 6.5. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that anything under a 7 isn't worth your time. I was only as hard on Octopath during my review as I was because I've heard nothing but praise about it. And as someone who's been playing nothing but RPGs for the last 2 months, I noticed a lot of stuff people failed to mention in their reviews. Still, Octopath does some interesting things and is worth a bit of your attention. Knowing what I do now, I probably would have waited for a price drop though. As always, likes and comments are always appreciated. I'm sure my experiences with this game were different from a majority of folks. Next video, I'll likely be talking about my impressions of Nintendo's Smash Bros. Ultimate Direct, which featured a few days ago. So look forward to that. Thank you for watching and have a wonderful day.